They say blood is thicker than water, but that Sunday evening in Portland, it felt more like poison coursing through my veins. The rain drummed against the windows of Mamma Mia's Italian kitchen while my family sat around the red-checkered tablecloth, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of hanging Edison bulbs. What should have been our monthly celebration dinner had turned into an ambush, and I was staring at a handwritten list of numbers that supposedly represented my moral obligations. $28,000. That's what my mother had calculated. I owed my little brother for his college education. $28,000 that I had scraped together, penny by penny, working double shifts at Portland General Hospital, skipping meals, driving a beat-up Honda Civic with a rattling exhaust pipe. Money I had saved for my own future, my own dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse practitioner. But according to the woman who raised me, who taught me about family loyalty and putting others first, those dreams were apparently negotiable. Dylan's weren't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming. The signs were scattered throughout my entire life like breadcrumbs, leading to this moment of betrayal, but I had been too busy being the good daughter to follow the trail. Growing up in our suburban Beaverton home, I learned early that love in the Chen household came with conditions, and those conditions seemed to shift depending on which child you happened to be. When I was 7 and Dylan was barely walking, I watched my parents beam with pride as he took his first steps across our hardwood living room floor. The whole extended family gathered around him, cameras flashing, voices raised in celebration. That same week, I had won first place in the elementary school science fair, with a project about plant growth that I had worked on for months, staying up past my bedtime to water my bean sprouts and record their progress in careful handwriting. My parents attended the ceremony, clapped politely, and took one photo. The ribbon went into a drawer somewhere, forgotten by dinner time. Dylan's first steps were framed and hung in the hallway where everyone could see them. The pattern continued as we grew older, so gradually and consistently that I began to think it was normal. When Dylan wanted to play basketball in middle school, my parents immediately signed him up for the most expensive league in the city, bought him premium equipment, and rearranged their schedules to attend every game. When I expressed interest in joining the debate team, they told me it sounded time-consuming, and that I should focus on my grades instead. When Dylan crashed his first car at 16, a minor fender bender in a parking lot, my father was already researching replacement vehicles before the tow truck arrived. When I asked if I could get driving lessons at the same age, they explained that cars were expensive and maybe I could learn when I turned 18. When Dylan struggled with algebra, they hired a private tutor at $60 an hour. When I needed help with AP chemistry, they told me the library had books and I was smart enough to figure it out myself. But perhaps the most telling incident happened during my senior year of high school. I had been accepted to Portland State University with a partial scholarship, but I still needed money for room and board. I had been working part-time at a local grocery store for 2 years, saving every dollar I could, but it wasn't enough. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one evening in March, surrounded by financial aid forms and acceptance letters, trying to calculate how many more hours I would need to work to make college possible. My parents sat across from me, and I gathered the courage to ask if they could help with the remaining costs. My mother looked at me over her reading glasses and said that they had always taught me to be independent, and that figuring out how to pay for college would be a good learning experience. Independence, she said, would serve me well in life. 3 months later, they surprised Dylan with a brand new iPhone for his 14th birthday, even though his old phone worked perfectly fine. The phone cost more than what I had asked them to contribute to my education. I learned to swallow the disappointment, to rationalize their choices, to tell myself that their behavior wasn't personal. Maybe they were right about independence being valuable. Maybe I was better off learning to rely on myself. Maybe their different treatment of Dylan wasn't favoritism, but simply different parenting styles for different children. I became an expert at making excuses for them, at finding logical explanations for emotional wounds that never quite healed. I told myself that love looked different for everyone, and that just because they expressed pride in Dylan more openly didn't mean they loved me less. I convinced myself that their financial support of his activities and lack of support for mine was about timing or circumstances or their changing financial situation. I became so skilled at this internal negotiation that I almost believed it myself. College came and went in a blur of work-study programs, weekend shifts, and careful budgeting. While my classmates complained about dining hall food, I was grateful to have any meal plan at all. While they worried about maintaining their GPAs, I juggled coursework with 20-hour work weeks to pay for textbooks and lab fees. I graduated with my nursing degree debt-free, not because my parents supported me, but because I had learned to support myself. The day I graduated, they attended the ceremony and took photos, and my mother even teared up a little during the speech. For a moment, I felt that warm glow of parental pride that I had watched Dylan bask in his entire life. But during the family dinner afterward, the conversation quickly shifted to Dylan's upcoming senior year of high school and his college prospects. My achievement became background noise to discussions of his future. By the time Dylan was applying to colleges, I had been working as a registered nurse for 3 years. I loved my job at Portland General Hospital, working in the pediatric unit where I could combine my medical skills with my natural instinct to care for children. But I had bigger dreams. I wanted to become a pediatric nurse practitioner, to have more autonomy in patient care, to specialize in helping families navigate complex medical situations. The graduate program I had my eyes on was competitive and expensive, but I had been preparing for years. Every paycheck, I religiously transferred money into my savings account. Every bonus, every overtime shift, every tax refund went toward my graduate school fund. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Southeast Portland, drove my reliable but aging Honda Civic, and bought generic groceries to stretch my budget. My social life suffered as I chose saving money over going out with friends, but I kept my eyes on the prize. $28,000 was my magic number, enough to cover the program costs while allowing me to work part-time and maintain a minimal standard of living. Dylan, meanwhile, had blossomed into everything my parents had always hoped he would become. He was tall and athletic, charming in the way that made adults smile and his peers gravitate toward him. His basketball skills had improved dramatically over the years, and he had become one of the star players on his high school team. His grades were decent, not exceptional, but good enough to keep him eligible for sports. College recruiters had started showing interest, and suddenly our family dinners were filled with discussions of Division II schools and athletic scholarships. My parents glowed with pride as they talked about his prospects, about the phone calls from coaches, about the possibility of their son playing college basketball. It was everything they had dreamed of when they first enrolled him in that expensive youth league all those years ago. But as Dylan's senior year progressed, it became clear that the athletic scholarship offers weren't materializing the way my parents had expected. He was good, but not quite good enough for a full ride. The schools that wanted him were offering partial scholarships, enough to help with costs, but not enough to cover everything. And the school that Dylan had fallen in love with, Pacific Northwest University, was a prestigious private college with an excellent basketball program and a price tag to match, $45,000 per year for tuition, room, and board. Even with the partial athletic scholarship they were offering, the family would need to come up with $30,000 annually. Over 4 years, that was more money than my parents had ever spent on anything except their house. I first heard about Dylan's college situation during one of our monthly family dinners in December. We were gathered around the dining room table in my parents' house, the same table where I had filled out my own college applications years earlier. Dylan was practically bouncing in his chair as he talked about Pacific Northwest University, about their campus, their facilities, their basketball program. My mother and father hung on his every word, asking questions about his potential teammates and the coaching staff. It was clear that they saw this as the culmination of years of investment in his athletic development, the payoff for all those league fees and equipment costs and travel expenses, but I could also see the worry creeping into their expressions when the conversation turned to finances. My father, typically the more practical of my parents, finally broached the subject that everyone was dancing around. The numbers, he said, were challenging. Even with Dylan's partial scholarship, they would need to find significant additional funding. They had some money saved, he explained, but not nearly enough to cover 4 years at such an expensive school. They had been exploring options, looking into loans, considering whether Dylan might need to choose a less expensive college instead. The disappointment in Dylan's face was immediate and heartbreaking. This was clearly the school he had set his heart on, and the idea of having to settle for something else because of money was devastating to him. That's when my mother looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between hope and expectation. She mentioned, almost casually, that it was wonderful how I had been so responsible with money over the years, how I had managed to save so much while living on a nurse's salary. She talked about how proud they were of my financial discipline, my ability to live within my means and still put money aside for the future. She wondered aloud what I was planning to do with all that money I had saved, whether I had any immediate plans for it. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I felt a chill of recognition even though I couldn't quite name what I was recognizing. I explained that I was saving for graduate school, that I wanted to become a nurse practitioner, and had been working toward that goal for years. I talked about the program requirements, the costs, my timeline for applying. I was excited to share my plans with them, hoping that they would show the same enthusiasm for my educational goals that they had always shown for Dylan's athletic achievements. But instead of pride or encouragement, I saw something else in their faces. Disappointment, maybe, or frustration, as if having my own plans for my money was somehow inconsistent with their expectations. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could feel an undercurrent of tension for the rest of the evening. Dylan was quieter than usual, and my parents seemed distracted. When I hugged them goodbye and drove home to my apartment, I had a nagging feeling that something significant had just happened, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I replayed the dinner conversation in my mind as I got ready for bed, trying to understand why I felt so unsettled. It wasn't until I was lying in the dark that I realized what had bothered me most. My mother's question about my savings hadn't felt like casual curiosity. It had felt like an assessment, as if she was taking inventory of available resources for a purpose I didn't yet understand. Over the next few weeks, the subject of Dylan's college costs came up repeatedly in our family conversations. My parents seemed to be struggling with the financial reality of their son's educational dreams, and their stress was becoming increasingly apparent. They talked about the unfairness of college costs, about how difficult it was for middle-class families to afford quality education for their children. They mentioned repeatedly how much money they had already invested in Dylan's development over the years, how they had sacrificed for his athletic training and equipment. They spoke about their dreams for his future, about the opportunities that a good college education could provide for him. And gradually, subtly, they began to work me into these conversations. They started by asking my opinion about family obligations, about what siblings owed each other, about the importance of supporting family members' dreams. They talked about how lucky I was to have a stable job and income, how I didn't have the same time pressures that Dylan faced as a high school senior. They mentioned how much easier it was for me to pursue education as an adult, how I could take my time and apply to programs when it was convenient for me. Dylan, they pointed out, only had one chance to accept this college opportunity. If he turned it down now, it would be gone forever. I, on the other hand, could become a nurse practitioner anytime I wanted. Graduate programs would always be there. The logic was seductive in its apparent reasonableness, and I found myself starting to question my own priorities. Was I being selfish by holding on to my savings when my brother needed help achieving his dreams? Was my graduate school plan really that urgent, or was it something I could postpone for a few years? My parents were skilled at framing their arguments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In terms of family values and moral obligations, making it seem as though the right choice was obvious to anyone who truly cared about family. They never directly asked me for money during these conversations, but the implication was becoming clearer each time we spoke. Meanwhile, Dylan himself seemed to be struggling with the possibility that he might not be able to attend his dream school. He became moody and withdrawn, no longer the cheerful, confident young man who had been the center of our family's attention for so many years. My parents' worry about his emotional state became another layer of pressure, another reason why finding a solution to the college funding problem was urgent. They talked about how hard he had worked for this opportunity, how devastating it would be for him to have to settle for a lesser school because of finances. They painted a picture of their son's future hanging in the balance, dependent on the family's ability to come together and support his dreams. The direct request finally came in February, during what I thought was going to be a casual lunch with my mother at a small cafe near the hospital where I worked. I had been looking forward to spending time with her one-on-one, something we rarely did. She had suggested the meeting, saying she wanted to catch up and hear about how things were going with my job. But as soon as we ordered our food, she steered the conversation toward Dylan's college situation. She explained that they had been crunching numbers and exploring options, and they had determined that they could make the finances work if they could find a way to come up with an additional $25,000 to $30,000. It was a lot of money, she acknowledged, but spread over 4 years it wouldn't be impossible to manage. Then she looked at me directly and said the words that would change everything between us. "We were hoping you might be willing to help make Dylan's dreams come true." She explained that they knew I had been saving money and they thought this might be a perfect opportunity for me to invest in family. Dylan was young and had his whole life ahead of him, she said. A good education would set him up for success and ensure that he could eventually support himself and contribute to the family's well-being. It was an investment, not a gift, she assured me. Once Dylan graduated and got established in his career, he would be able to pay me back with interest. In the meantime, I could delay my own graduate school plans for just a few years. I was already working as a nurse, already established in my career. I had the luxury of time that Dylan didn't have. I sat there staring at my untouched sandwich, trying to process what I was hearing. My mother continued talking, laying out the logic of her request, explaining how this arrangement would benefit everyone. Dylan would get his education, my parents would be able to afford the payments, and I would eventually get my money back with additional return on investment. It was, she said, a win-win situation for the whole family. The fact that it would require me to abandon my own educational goals, at least temporarily, was presented as a minor inconvenience rather than a significant sacrifice. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why they thought this was my responsibility. Why couldn't they take out loans like other families? Why couldn't Dylan choose a less expensive school? Why was my financial security being treated as a family resource rather than my personal achievement? My mother's response revealed the depth of her expectations and the fundamental way she viewed my role in the family. She said that they had always been proud of my independence and my ability to take care of myself, but that true independence meant being able to help family when they needed it. She talked about the sacrifices they had made for both Dylan and me over the years, conveniently ignoring the vast differences in how those sacrifices had been distributed. She reminded me that family was the most important thing in life, and that money was just money, but the opportunity to help my brother achieve his dreams was priceless. I left that lunch feeling as though I had been hit by a truck. The casual way my mother had presented her request, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, made me question everything I thought I knew about my place in the family. Had they always viewed my savings as a potential resource for Dylan's needs? Had my years of careful financial planning been seen as preparation for this moment? I drove back to work in a daze, unable to focus on anything except the conversation I had just had. My patients that afternoon probably wondered why their usually cheerful nurse seemed so distracted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my entire understanding of my family had just been turned upside down. That evening, I called my cousin Emma, who had always been more like a sister to me than Dylan ever was. Emma was 2 years younger than me, but had always been remarkably insightful about family dynamics. I needed to talk to someone who understood the complexities of our extended family but wasn't directly involved in the current situation. When I told her about my mother's request, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "You have got to be kidding me." Her outrage on my behalf was both validating and alarming. She pointed out things that I had been too close to see clearly, like the fact that my parents had never offered to help with my education, but expected me to fund Dylan's. She reminded me of the countless ways they had favored him over me throughout our lives, and she helped me see that this request was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a lifelong pattern. Emma's perspective gave me the clarity I needed to understand what was really happening. This wasn't about family loyalty or helping a brother achieve his dreams. This was about my parents' unwillingness to accept financial responsibility for choices they had encouraged Dylan to make. They had supported his focus on basketball over academics. They had encouraged him to pursue an expensive private college. and now they wanted me to bear the financial consequences of those decisions. They were asking me to sacrifice my own future to fund their vision of Dylan's future, and they were framing it as a moral obligation rather than the unreasonable request it actually was. Armed with Emma's perspective and a newfound understanding of what was truly being asked of me, I thought I had found the strength to resist my family's expectations. But I underestimated their determination and their willingness to escalate the pressure when gentle persuasion failed to achieve their desired outcome. What followed was a systematic campaign designed to wear down my resistance through guilt, manipulation, and the strategic deployment of every family relationship I held dear. It was psychological warfare disguised as loving concern, and it nearly broke me before I finally understood what I was really fighting against. The first escalation came just 3 days after my lunch with my mother. I was working a particularly challenging shift in the pediatric unit when my phone buzzed with a text message from Dylan himself. It was the first time he had contacted me directly about the college situation, and seeing his name on my screen filled me with a mixture of hope and dread. Maybe he wanted to have an honest conversation about the family dynamics, I thought. Maybe he was reaching out to acknowledge that the request was unfair, or to tell me that he had convinced our parents to explore other options. Instead, the message was a carefully crafted emotional appeal that had clearly been coached by someone with more sophisticated manipulation skills than an 18-year-old typically possesses. Dylan's text began with an apology for bothering me at work, demonstrating an awareness of my schedule and responsibilities that he had never shown before. He wrote about how much he admired my dedication to helping sick children, how he had always looked up to me as an example of someone who worked hard and achieved her goals. He said he understood that asking for my help wasn't fair, but that he was desperate and didn't know where else to turn. The basketball scholarship to Pacific Northwest University was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he explained, and he was terrified of losing it because of money. He promised that he would pay me back as soon as he could, that he would work part-time during college if necessary, that he would do whatever it took to make things right. The message ended with a statement that would haunt me for weeks. I know I don't deserve this, and I know you've already done so much for yourself, but you're the only person who can make this possible for me. I'll understand if you can't help, but I had to ask because you're my sister and I love you. Reading those words while standing in a hospital hallway, surrounded by the controlled chaos of medical professionals caring for children with serious illnesses, I felt my carefully constructed resolve begin to crumble. Dylan had never spoken to me with such vulnerability and honesty before. Throughout our childhood and adolescence, our relationship had been cordial but distant. Two siblings living parallel lives in the same house without much meaningful connection. He was the star athlete who lived in the spotlight of parental attention, while I was the responsible student who managed my own affairs and stayed out of the way. We had never had deep conversations about our dreams or fears, never confided in each other about personal struggles, never developed the kind of emotional intimacy that some siblings share. But this message felt different, more genuine than the calculated arguments our mother had presented over lunch. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to be the person who made Dylan's dreams possible. I pictured him calling me from college to share his successes, telling his teammates about his generous sister who had believed in him when no one else could help. I imagined family gatherings where I would finally be the one receiving grateful acknowledgement, where my contribution would be celebrated and remembered. The fantasy was seductive, offering me a chance to transform from the overlooked daughter into the family hero, the person whose sacrifice had enabled their golden child to achieve greatness. But even as I entertained these thoughts, I knew they were dangerous illusions that would ultimately lead to my own disappointment and resentment. I spent hours crafting my response to Dylan, writing and rewriting the message until I found words that felt both honest and kind. I told him that I understood how much the college opportunity meant to him, and that I wished there was a way for him to pursue it without creating financial strain for the family. I explained that I had been saving my money for my own educational goals, and that using it for his college would mean indefinitely postponing my plans to become a nurse practitioner. I suggested that he explore other funding options, including student loans, work-study programs, or choosing a less expensive school that would still provide him with a quality education and basketball opportunities. I tried to be supportive while still maintaining my boundaries, hoping that he would understand my position even if he was disappointed by my decision. Dylan's response came back within minutes, and it was drastically different in tone from his initial message. Gone was the vulnerable, apologetic young man who had reached out for help. Instead, his reply was cold and accusatory, questioning my priorities and my commitment to family. He wrote that he couldn't believe I would choose money over my own brother's future, that he had always thought I was more caring and generous than I was apparently revealing myself to be. He pointed out that I was already working as a nurse and didn't really need more education to have a successful career, while he was just starting out and needed this opportunity to build his entire future. He said that our parents had been right when they told him that some people become selfish when they get older and start thinking only about themselves. The message ended with a statement that felt like a slap across the face. I guess I was wrong about who you really are. I thought you cared about family, but I guess I don't know you as well as I thought I did. The transformation in Dylan's communication style was so dramatic that I wondered if someone else had written the second message, or at least heavily influenced its content. The language and arguments were remarkably similar to the points my mother had made during our lunch conversation, and the emotional manipulation tactics were far more sophisticated than I would have expected from my teenage brother. It became clear that my refusal to immediately comply with the family's request had triggered a coordinated response designed to attack my decision from multiple angles. Dylan was being positioned as the wounded victim, while I was being cast in the role of the selfish sister who had abandoned her family in their time of need. The campaign intensified over the following weeks, with different family members reaching out to share their perspectives on the situation. My Aunt Jessica called me one evening, ostensibly to catch up and see how I was doing, but the conversation quickly turned to Dylan's college predicament. She talked about how proud the whole family was of his athletic achievements, and how devastating it would be if he couldn't pursue his education because of financial constraints. She mentioned that she and Uncle Mark had been discussing the situation, and they were impressed by how much money I had managed to save on a nurse's salary. Jessica suggested that helping Dylan would be a wonderful investment in the family's future, and that everyone would remember and appreciate my generosity for years to come. She never directly asked me to give Dylan the money, but she made it clear that the entire extended family was aware of the situation and had opinions about what the right course of action should be. Uncle Mark took a different approach when he contacted me a few days later. Rather than focusing on emotional appeals, he presented what he called a practical analysis of the situation. He had apparently done research on nurse practitioner programs and discovered that many schools offered part-time or evening options that would allow students to continue working while pursuing their education. He suggested that this might be a perfect solution for me, since I could delay my full-time graduate school plans while still making progress toward my degree. Meanwhile, Dylan could attend Pacific Northwest University and begin building his career immediately, taking advantage of an opportunity that wouldn't be available to him later. Mark framed this as a win-win scenario, where both siblings could achieve their goals, just on slightly different timelines. His approach was more subtle than the others, but the underlying message was the same. My educational plans were flexible and could be adjusted, while Dylan's were urgent and non-negotiable. The most painful intervention came from my father, who had always been less vocal than my mother, but whose opinions carried particular weight with me because of their rarity. He invited me to lunch on a Saturday afternoon, choosing a quiet restaurant where we could talk without interruption. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed my work at the hospital and his recent projects at the insurance company where he worked. It felt like a normal father-daughter conversation, the kind of casual interaction we had always been able to maintain despite the complicated family dynamics. But then he shifted the discussion to Dylan's situation, and I realized that even this lunch had been orchestrated as part of the pressure campaign. My father's approach was different from the emotional manipulation I had experienced from other family members. Instead, he talked about responsibility and long-term thinking, presenting the request for financial help as a test of my character and maturity. He said that he and my mother had been discussing my response to their request, and they were concerned about what my refusal revealed about my values and priorities. They had always been proud of my independence and self-sufficiency, he explained, but they were beginning to wonder if those qualities had made me too focused on my own needs and insufficiently concerned about the welfare of others. He talked about the importance of family loyalty and mutual support, suggesting that my willingness to help Dylan would demonstrate that I had learned the right lessons about what mattered most in life. What made this conversation particularly difficult was my father's tone, which remained calm and reasonable throughout. He never raised his voice or made direct accusations, but he managed to communicate profound disappointment in my choices while maintaining the facade of loving concern. He talked about how much Dylan looked up to me, and how my refusal to help him was causing the young man to question his own worth and potential. He mentioned that my mother was losing sleep over the situation, worried about both Dylan's future and the growing tension within the family. He suggested that I take some time to reconsider my decision, emphasizing that it wasn't too late to change my mind and do the right thing for everyone involved. By the time I left that lunch, I felt emotionally battered and confused about my own motivations. My father's words had planted seeds of doubt about my decision, making me question whether I was being genuinely principled or simply selfish. Was I refusing to help Dylan because I truly believed it was wrong to sacrifice my own goals for his, or was I just being stubborn and ungenerous? Was my attachment to my savings account a sign of healthy financial planning, or evidence of an unhealthy obsession with money? These questions tormented me for days, making it difficult to focus on work or enjoy any of my usual activities. The situation became even more complicated when I started receiving pressure from unexpected sources within our extended family network. Cousins I rarely spoke to began reaching out on social media, sharing articles about the importance of family support and the value of investing in young people's education. Family friends who had known me since childhood made casual comments about how wonderful it was when siblings helped each other achieve their dreams. Even my grandmother, my mother's mother who lived in an assisted living facility across town, called to tell me how proud she was of Dylan's accomplishments and how much she hoped he would be able to attend his dream school. Each of these interactions felt carefully orchestrated to create the impression that everyone in our social network expected me to help Dylan, and that my continued refusal was becoming a source of embarrassment for the entire family. The message was clear. I was the outlier, the one person who was failing to recognize her obvious moral obligation. The isolation was intentional and effective, making me feel like I was fighting against not just my immediate family but the entire community of people who had known and loved me throughout my life. The campaign reached its peak when my mother called me one evening in tears, sobbing into the phone about how the stress of the situation was affecting everyone in the family. She said that Dylan had become depressed and withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room and refusing to discuss alternative college options. She claimed that his basketball coach had noticed a decline in his performance and attitude, and that his grades were starting to slip as he lost motivation for his senior year studies. She painted a picture of a young man whose spirit was being crushed by the family's inability to support his dreams, and she made it clear that she held me responsible for his deteriorating condition. My mother's emotional breakdown was devastating to witness, even over the phone. She had always been the strong one in our family, the person who managed crises, and kept everyone moving forward when things got difficult. Hearing her cry and blame herself for failing to provide for her son was almost unbearable, especially when she kept apologizing for asking too much of me, and expressing regret for putting me in such a difficult position. She said that she understood why I wanted to protect my savings, and that she didn't blame me for prioritizing my own future. But she also made it clear that she didn't know how to fix the situation without my help, and that she was running out of options for making Dylan's college dreams possible. The conversation lasted over an hour, with my mother alternating between emotional appeals and practical discussions about potential solutions. She had apparently spent considerable time researching loan options and exploring other funding possibilities, but none of them seemed adequate to bridge the financial gap. She talked about the possibility of refinancing their house or taking money from their retirement accounts, but she explained that both of those options would create long-term financial hardship for her and my father. She had even considered asking other family members for loans, but she realized that no one else had the kind of money that would be needed to make a real difference. I was, she said, the only person in the family who was in a position to solve this problem, and she felt terrible about the burden that placed on me. As I listened to my mother's desperation and pain, I felt my resolve weakening once again. The logical arguments I had rehearsed with Emma seemed cold and selfish when measured against my family's obvious suffering. How could I hold on to money for my own future plans when my brother was spiraling into depression and my parents were facing financial ruin? How could I prioritize my professional ambitions over my family's immediate crisis? The guilt was overwhelming, and I found myself wondering if I had been wrong to refuse their initial request. But even as I wrestled with these emotions, a part of me recognized that something fundamentally unfair was happening in these conversations. The entire family crisis had been framed as my responsibility to solve, rather than as a consequence of unrealistic expectations and poor financial planning. No one was questioning why Dylan had been encouraged to pursue such an expensive college option without adequate funding in place. No one was suggesting that he should consider less costly alternatives or take on more personal responsibility for financing his education. No one was acknowledging that I had worked and saved for years to accumulate the money they now wanted me to surrender. The entire burden of finding a solution had been placed on my shoulders, and my reluctance to accept that burden was being treated as a moral failing, rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable request. The breaking point came when Dylan himself showed up at my apartment one evening, looking more serious and mature than I had ever seen him. He said that he wanted to have an honest conversation about the situation, without our parents' involvement or influence. He acknowledged that asking for my money wasn't fair, and that he understood why I was reluctant to give up my savings for his college expenses. But he also explained how much the opportunity meant to him, and how devastated he would be if he had to settle for a different school because of finances. He talked about the basketball program, the academic reputation, and the connections he could make that would benefit him throughout his career. He promised that he would pay me back within 5 years of graduation, with interest, and that he would sign any legal documents necessary to formalize the arrangement. What made this conversation different from the others was Dylan's apparent willingness to acknowledge the sacrifice he was asking me to make. He said that he knew delaying my graduate school plans would be difficult, and that he felt guilty about asking me to put my dreams on hold for his. But he also argued that his opportunity was time-sensitive in a way that mine wasn't, and that helping him now would ultimately benefit both of us when he became successful and could repay the loan with generous interest. He presented his request as a business proposition rather than a family obligation, suggesting that I should think of it as an investment in his future earning potential rather than a gift that would deplete my savings. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was having a genuine conversation with my brother rather than being subjected to a coordinated manipulation campaign. Dylan seemed to understand the complexity of what he was asking, and he was offering specific terms and timelines that addressed some of my concerns about the arrangement. I found myself actually considering his proposal, running mental calculations about whether the financial risk might be worth taking if it could resolve the family crisis and repair the relationships that had been damaged by weeks of conflict. But as we talked longer, I began to notice inconsistencies in Dylan's presentation that suggested his apparent maturity and reasonableness were somewhat scripted. His knowledge of loan terms and repayment schedules seemed unusually sophisticated for someone who had never managed significant finances. His arguments about the time-sensitive nature of his opportunity and the flexibility of my graduate school timeline echoed points that other family members had made in previous conversations. Most tellingly, when I asked him about specific alternative colleges he had considered, or other funding sources he had explored, his answers were vague and dismissive. It became clear that the family had settled on my money as their preferred solution, and that other options hadn't been seriously investigated. The conversation ended without resolution, but it clarified something important for me about the nature of the conflict I was facing. This wasn't really about Dylan's college education, or even about the specific amount of money involved. It was about fundamental differences in how my family understood personal autonomy, financial responsibility, and the obligations that family members owed to each other. They viewed my savings as a family resource that should be deployed to solve family problems, while I viewed it as the product of my individual effort and sacrifice that I had the right to control. They saw my refusal to help as evidence of selfishness and poor values, while I saw their request as evidence of entitlement and poor boundaries. Understanding this deeper conflict helped me realize that no amount of negotiation or compromise would truly resolve the situation. Even if I agreed to lend Dylan the money, the underlying disagreement about my role in the family and my right to make independent financial decisions would remain. My parents would continue to view me as someone whose resources should be available to meet family needs, and they would likely make similar requests in the future when other crises arose. Meanwhile, I would continue to feel resentful about being expected to sacrifice my own goals for the benefit of family members who had never been asked to make comparable sacrifices for me. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that I had the intellectual framework necessary to resist the ongoing pressure campaign, But it also meant that standing my ground would likely result in permanent damage to my family relationships. I could see that my parents and Dylan were not going to accept my refusal gracefully or respectfully. They had invested too much in their vision of me as the family problem solver, and my continued resistance threatened their understanding of how family dynamics should work. The conflict was heading toward an ultimatum, and I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that choosing my own financial security might cost me my family's love and acceptance. The final phase of the pressure campaign began in earnest during the last week of March, as college decision deadlines approached, and the family's desperation reached a fever pitch. My mother started calling me multiple times per day, sometimes just to cry about the situation, and sometimes to present new arguments for why I should reconsider my position. She had apparently consulted with financial advisors and discovered that nurse practitioner programs were increasingly offering online and part-time options, which she presented as evidence that I could pursue my education while working full-time, and wouldn't really need my savings for living expenses. She had also researched average salaries for nurse practitioners and calculated that the increased earning potential would allow me to rebuild my savings relatively quickly after graduation. These arguments revealed how much effort my family was putting into finding ways to minimize the significance of what they were asking me to sacrifice. Rather than acknowledging that using my graduate school fund for Dylan's college would represent a major setback to my own plans, they were working hard to convince both me and themselves that the impact would be minimal and temporary. They needed to believe that their request was reasonable and fair, because accepting the alternative would force them to confront some uncomfortable truths about their priorities and their treatment of their children. The pressure reached its crescendo during our monthly family dinner at the end of March, which had been moved to Mamma Mia's Italian kitchen because my mother said she was too stressed to cook. The atmosphere was tense from the moment I arrived, with Dylan looking sullen and my parents wearing expressions of grim determination. It was clear that this dinner had been planned as a final attempt to secure my cooperation, and that they had prepared for the possibility that I might continue to refuse their request. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.